There are moments in life when the noise of the world is no longer enough, when success, accumulation, and distraction begin to feel empty. It is then that the soul, quiet yet persistent, begins to whisper. Sometimes it whispers through pain, other times through an inexplicable restlessness. That whisper, although unsettling, is an invitation to look within, to go beyond the surface, to dive into the mystery that we are. Carl Jung, with visionary clarity, offers us a map for that journey. His famous phrase, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate," is not merely a warning. It's a master key to deciphering our existence. But to truly understand it, it's not enough to grasp it intellectually. You must live it, cross through it, embody it. In the domain of classical psychoanalysis, the unconscious was once framed narrowly, as a reservoir of repressed instincts, censored desires, and traumatic residues. Freud saw it as a crypt beneath the ego, a pressure system of forbidden impulses striving for release. But Carl Jung expanded this view, not by rejecting it but by deepening it. For Jung, the unconscious is not merely pathological, it is ontological. It is not just what we hide from ourselves, but what we have not yet become. The unconscious is not a storage unit for the past, but a living field, dynamic, teleological, symbolic. It includes the personal unconscious, populated with complexes shaped by individual experience, but it also stretches into the collective unconscious, a psychic substratum shared across cultures and epochs, inhabited by archetypes, the primordial patterns of human experience. To live without a conscious relationship to this dimension is not neutrality, it is neurosis. For Jung, the unconscious is not beneath the ego in a hierarchical sense, but rather beneath in depth, a dimension whose logic is not rational but symbolic, whose language is not declarative but mythopoetic. It speaks in the currency of dreams, archetypes, images, moods, and synchronicities. These are not accidental phenomena, they are semiotic eruptions of meaning, signaling the soul's orientation toward individuation, the lifelong process of becoming psychologically whole. In this sense, the unconscious does not merely reflect past wounds, it anticipates potential, it is portentive, oriented toward what one could be, not just what one has suffered. As Jung noted, the unconscious is not just evil by nature, it is also the source of the highest good, not only dark but also light, not only bestial, semi-human and demonic, but superhuman, spiritual, and, in the classical sense of the word, divine. And yet, in the modern subject, the unconscious has been relegated to irrelevance. The modern psyche is conditioned not to explore inward, but to orient outward, toward efficiency, image, control. We are educated into functional dissociation, taught to analyze but not to reflect, to perform but not to feel, to produce but not to be. In such a cultural architecture, the unconscious becomes not only unknown but unknowable, its messages drowned in the noise of algorithmic distraction and neoliberal performance. To Jung, this disconnection from the unconscious is not merely a personal dilemma but a civilizational pathology. When symbolic life is repressed, it does not disappear, it returns in symptomatic form, in anxiety without object, depression without origin, compulsions without satisfaction. The soul will be heard, one way or another. Until you make the unconscious conscious, Jung wrote, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. This is not metaphor, but psychological structure. Those who do not confront their inner multiplicity become acted upon by it. One lives in reactive loops, ensnared by internal contradictions one cannot name, repeating patterns as if compelled by invisible hands. To engage with the unconscious, then, is not regression, it is integration. It is the work of reconciling what the ego excludes, the irrational, the instinctual, the mythical, the disowned. In Jungian terms, this is the path of individuation, not toward perfection, but toward inner coherence. It is the act of becoming oneself, not the persona curated for the social stage, but the totality of one's being, including the parts we fear, the parts we reject, and the parts we have never yet lived. To ignore the unconscious is to forfeit authorship of one's life. To enter it is to risk disorientation, but also to reclaim sovereignty over one's destiny. It is not an easy descent. But in its depths lies everything that makes life meaningful, tragic, creative, and fully human. Carl Jung's most radical contribution to psychology may not be the collective unconscious or even archetypes, but the concept of the shadow, that internal double, the psychic twin we work tirelessly to avoid, repress, and deny. To Jung, the shadow is not a metaphor. It is a structural reality of the psyche. It is comprised of all the contents of the self that the ego finds incompatible with its self-image, Our rage, envy, addictive impulses, sexual compulsions, cowardice, pettiness, narcissism, arrogance, but also, crucially, our intuition, our vulnerability, our natural authority, our forbidden joy and repressed brilliance. The shadow is not inherently evil. It is not the Freudian ID, merely the seat of unchecked drives. It is simply what remains unseen. What is disowned becomes distorted. What is unloved becomes dangerous. What is rejected does not disappear. It waits underground, gaining power in silence. Most of us build a life around the avoidance of the shadow. We construct personas, social masks, to ensure we remain acceptable to the world. But what we exile internally always returns through projection. That is, what we cannot own in ourselves we begin to see and despise in others. We demonize the ambitious, though we secretly hunger for power. We mock the emotionally expressive, though we long to be seen. We condemn the selfish, while silently resenting our chronic self-sacrifice. Jung warned, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." This is the dark mirror the shadow holds before us. The truth that the enemy outside often reflects the exile within. When the shadow remains unconscious, it doesn't simply vanish. It acts autonomously, in our relationships, our patterns, our sudden outbursts. It slips into moments of sabotage, into compulsions we don't understand, into the repetitive dramas that play out in our emotional lives. Thus, the shadow is not just a psychological category, it is an ethical challenge. For to encounter the shadow is to confront the painful discrepancy between who we think we are and who we actually are. It is to admit that the ego's version of the self is partial, curated, and often dishonest. But here lies the paradox. What we fear most in the shadow is often what we most need to reclaim. The capacity to say no, the ability to rage when violated, the erotic vitality buried beneath moral conditioning, the creative force smothered by duty, the inner knowing that was once dismissed as irrational. To integrate the shadow is not to justify all of our behaviors, but to take moral ownership of our wholeness. To say this too is me, not as excuse but as recognition. This is what Jung meant when he said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light but by making the darkness conscious." To make the shadow conscious is an act of psychological alchemy, transforming the rejected into the reclaimed, the feared into the integrated. It demands not repression but relationship, not indulgence but recognition. To approach the shadow is to sit with the discomfort of our contradictions, to ask, what part of myself have I exiled to become acceptable? And, what vital energy lies trapped behind that mask? In this confrontation, something extraordinary occurs. The very forces that once threatened to unravel us become sources of depth, insight, and power. The shadow, when faced and held, ceases to control us from below, and instead fuels our becoming. It is no exaggeration to say that the integration of the shadow is the beginning of authentic freedom. For until we are whole, we are not truly free. And until we are honest about the other that lives in us, we remain strangers to ourselves. In the framework of Jungian psychology, the goal of life is not moral rectitude, social status, or the accumulation of achievements. These are the aims of the ego, the conscious I that is shaped by culture, education, family expectations, and fear of rejection. But beneath the ego lies a deeper archetypal process, the path of individuation, the soul's inward journey toward wholeness. Individuation is not a linear progression of self-improvement. It is not self-optimization, productivity, or positive thinking. It is a psycho-spiritual metamorphosis, a lifelong process by which the fragmented elements of the psyche are brought into conscious relationship with one another, leading to a more integrated and authentic mode of being. At the heart of this process is the self, a central organizing principle within the psyche that transcends the ego. The self is not merely another part of us, it is the totality of who we are and who we are becoming, a synthesis of opposites, a field in which light and shadow, masculine and feminine, instinct and intellect, chaos and order, can coexist without contradiction. Jung described the self as both the blueprint and the architect of individuation. It is not something we invent. It is something that emerges when we dare to surrender the mask we wear to be accepted, the persona, and confront the terrifying freedom of our deepest nature. The privilege of a lifetime, Jung wrote, is to become who you truly are. But this becoming does not occur without rupture. Every genuine movement toward the self requires a symbolic death, a disintegration of the structures that once secured us, the roles we clung to, the identities we were praised for, the beliefs we inherited without question. All must be burned in the fire of inner truth. This is the crisis of individuation. It is the dark night of the soul, when the old compass no longer works, when the ego realizes it is not the master but the servant of something deeper, older, wiser. This descent into inner chaos is not pathology, it is initiation. We lose ourselves so we might find what was never lost, only buried. In the ruins of what we thought we were, the self begins to stir. This psychic process mirrors ancient myths, of descent into the underworld, of death and rebirth, of gods torn apart and remade whole. Because individuation is not personal, it is archetypal. Every human soul walks this path, consciously or unconsciously, across cultures, religions, and histories, and yet few complete it. Why? Because to individuate means to risk rejection, to confront unbearable loneliness, to walk away from the familiar lies that once made us feel safe. It demands a radical confrontation with our own freedom. And freedom, in its truest form, is terrifying. It means we can no longer blame the world, or our parents, or our partners. It means we must now answer to our own soul. But for those who endure the fire, the reward is nothing less than psychological rebirth, not perfection, but integration, not happiness, but meaning, not safety, but authenticity. To individuate is to become a vessel through which the self can express itself in the world, not as performance, but as presence. It is not an escape from life, but a radical entrance into it. And so we must ask, what am I clinging to that is killing me? What part of me must die so that something truer can be born? What soul is waiting behind the scaffolding of the persona I've outgrown? Individuation does not promise comfort. It promises wholeness. The unconscious does not speak in logic. It does not argue, compare, or persuade. It does not use language in the way the ego does. Instead, it speaks in symbols. Images that condense layers of emotional, spiritual, ancestral, and psychological meaning into forms that defy reduction. And the dream is its most intimate letter. For Jung, dreams were not random neurological discharges or meaningless byproducts of the day's mental clutter. Each dream, he believed, is a communication from the unconscious to the ego, an encoded message designed to help the conscious mind integrate what it has repressed, ignored, or cannot yet see. A dream is not a distraction, it is a guide, a mirror, a warning, and sometimes even a prophecy. But in the hyper-rational materialist worldview of the modern West, we have lost our symbolic literacy. We treat dreams as nonsense. We dismiss intuition as irrational. We ignore synchronicity as coincidence. But in doing so, we sever our relationship with the very language of the soul. A symbol is not a sign. It is not reducible to a simple definition or a direct meaning. A stop sign means stop. That is a sign. But a symbol is a bridge between conscious and unconscious, between matter and spirit, between the personal and the archetypal. Symbols link the visible to the invisible, the ego to the self, the individual to the collective memory of humanity. In dreams, the symbol is not meant to be solved like a puzzle. It is meant to be engaged, felt, meditated on, and lived. A snake in a dream might represent fear or betrayal, as popular interpretations suggest. But in Jungian terms, it could also signify transformation, sexual energy, primal wisdom, or the emergence of instinctual power. For example, a man dreams of being chased by a lion. He wakes up in a sweat and dismisses it. But under analysis, the lion may represent the raw masculine strength he has repressed all his life, perhaps out of fear of being too aggressive or of repeating his father's violence. The dream is not warning him of danger, it is inviting him to integrate his power in a conscious way. Or, a woman dreams of drowning in an ocean. Rather than interpreting it as anxiety or stress, the symbolic image may reveal a needed descent into feeling, the ocean being a representation of the unconscious itself. Her ego may be resisting grief, sadness, or transformation. The dream is urging her to let go of control and surrender to inner depth. Jung wrote, "The dream is a spontaneous self-portrayal, in symbolic form of the actual situation in the unconscious." And unlike the conscious mind, the unconscious does not moralize or flatter. It shows us what we need to see, not what we want to see. The symbolic nature of dreams is not new. In ancient cultures, dreams were considered sacred. The Greeks sought healing in Asclepions, temples where dreams were used for diagnosis and divine guidance. Shamans in indigenous societies entered altered states to encounter dream figures and spirit animals, which they interpreted as messages from ancestors or the cosmos. In fairy tales and myths, symbols function as encoded maps of psychological transformation. The forest, the dragon, the hidden treasure, the wise old man or woman. All of these are archetypal images that appear not only in stories, but also in our dreams. The hero in myth who descends into the underworld is the same energy that compels you to face depression, grief, or trauma in your own dreamscape. The unconscious in this sense is not only personal, it is also transpersonal. It draws from the collective unconscious, Jung's term for the shared psychic inheritance of humankind, a realm inhabited by archetypes that have shaped human consciousness for millennia. To interpret a dream is not to decode it like a machine, it is to enter into relationship with it, to allow the symbol to act upon you, to stir reflection, to unlock forgotten memories, or to reveal future possibilities. This is why Jung emphasized active imagination, a practice where one works consciously with the images of the unconscious, through writing, drawing, or inner dialogue. The goal is not analysis for the sake of clarity, but participation for the sake of transformation, because dreams are not explanations, they are experiences. They do not merely tell you who you are, they show you who you are becoming. But to hear their voice, we must slow down. We must stop treating the unconscious as irrelevant or inferior, and instead recognize it as the deeper intelligence that has been guiding humanity long before we learned to speak. The dream is the small, hidden door in the deepest and most intimate sanctum of the soul, Jung said. It opens into that cosmic night which was psyche long before there was any ego consciousness. To dream, then, is not to escape reality. It is to encounter it in its symbolic fullness. The soul is still speaking. The question is, do we remember how to listen? Carl Jung regarded psychology not as a cold science of behavior but as a sacred art, a modern-day form of alchemy. In his view, the ancient alchemists were not simply early chemists tinkering with primitive metallurgy. They were mystics in disguise, projecting the deep processes of inner transformation onto matter. Their attempt to transmute base metals into gold was not merely physical, it was a symbolic drama, an external mirror of the psyche's own quest for wholeness. To Jung, the lead represented the raw, unrefined, wounded, and unconscious parts of the human being, the shadow, the complexes, the inherited traumas, the instinctual drives we disown. The gold symbolized the final stage of individuation, a state of integration, inner sovereignty, and psychic unity, where light and dark are no longer in opposition but held within a larger container, the self. The stages of alchemical transformation were not random operations, they were mythic in structure. And Jung saw in them a symbolic roadmap of inner transformation, a sacred sequence that the soul must undergo in order to awaken. Nigredo, blackening. The descent into chaos, confusion, depression, or crisis. This is the breakdown of the ego's defenses. The world becomes opaque, meaning collapses, and suffering becomes unavoidable. Psychologically, it corresponds to the dark night of the soul. It is the confrontation with the shadow, with mortality, with the unlived self. Albedo, whitening, the cleansing stage. Illusions are stripped away. The psyche enters a more reflective state. There is sorrow but also clarity. One begins to separate from collective noise and face the inner world with honesty. This stage can bring guilt, humility, and the birth of conscience. Citrinitas, yellowing, the illumination of the deeper self. Here, insight begins to arise. The inner opposites, reason and feeling, masculine and feminine, chaos and order, begin to dialogue. The ego surrenders its control and starts to serve something deeper. This stage gives birth to authentic intuition and creative imagination. Rubedo, reddening, the final stage of integration where the opposites are reconciled and the self is realized. It is not perfection, but wholeness. The gold of inner alchemy emerges not as something achieved but as something uncovered. In this sacred sequence we see what Jung meant when he said, "The sole purpose of human existence is to kindle a light in the darkness of mere being." Modern culture treats suffering as a pathology, an error to be eradicated. We numb it, outsource it, avoid it, but Jung's alchemical model insists on something far more daring and redemptive. We are not meant to eliminate suffering, we are meant to give it meaning. In alchemy, the fire that burns is the same fire that transforms. The soul does not evolve by avoiding crisis, but by entering it consciously, symbolically, ethically. When we descend into our own darkness with awareness, we engage in the true opus, psychic transmutation. This is not passive endurance, it is active inner work, what Jung called the opus contra naturam, the work against nature. Because the instinct of the ego is to escape pain, but the demand of the self is to descend into it and mine its symbolic value. Every loss becomes a threshold, every wound becomes a portal, every encounter with the shadow becomes an invitation to greater integration. When we resist this alchemical process, suffering remains raw and chaotic, but when we turn toward it, suffer it consciously, dream it, speak it, ritualize it, we initiate a transformation of substance. Lead does not become gold through willpower. It becomes gold through symbolic engagement, repetition, fire, and grace. To live symbolically is to recognize that crisis is never meaningless, that despair contains secret architecture, and that the soul is not shattered by suffering but shaped through it. In each of us there is another whom we do not know, Jung wrote. He speaks to us in dreams, and tells us how differently he sees us from the way we see ourselves. The task of alchemy is to meet that inner figure, to be burned, dissolved, purified, and in the end to emerge not perfect but whole. To make the unconscious conscious is not a matter of technique. It is not a productivity hack, a therapeutic protocol, or a checklist item in a self-improvement regime. It is, in the truest sense, an art, a sacred, difficult, lifelong devotion. It is not something we do to ourselves, but something we surrender to, something we become. A form of spirituality not in the religious sense but in the sense of a radical reorientation toward inner truth. This is an inner revolution, one that dismantles not institutions but illusions. It is the quiet seismic shift in perception that changes how we see the world, how we love, how we suffer, how we create, and how we inhabit our own bodies. The person who has begun the work of integrating their shadow no longer walks through life anesthetized. They are awake, and that is dangerous in a world built on sleep. To make the unconscious conscious is not a private psychological luxury. It is a political act, in the most profound sense of the word. Why? Because the truly conscious individual cannot be controlled. They cannot be manipulated by fear because they have already faced the monster within. They cannot be seduced by scapegoats, ideologies, or mass hysteria because they no longer need to project their inner demons onto the world. They have withdrawn their projections, reclaimed their shadow, and in doing so, have become whole. Such a human being is unmanipulable, not because they resist power, but because they are no longer fractured. They have retrieved the dismembered parts of their psyche, the shame, the rage, the grief, the madness, the animal instinct, the forgotten joy, and made room for all of it. In doing so, they no longer need to dominate or be dominated. They no longer seek enemies outside to fight battles that were always inside. As Jung said, knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darkness of other people. This work, the work of psychological wholeness, is therefore revolutionary because it produces individuals who see through the game of blame, division, consumption, and fear. It is no coincidence that modern society offers 1,000 distractions but almost no real support for depth, silence, introspection, or inner work. To the collective ego, the engine of mass culture, media hysteria, political polarization, and superficial identity, the individuated person is a threat. Because they do not belong. They cannot be rallied into mindless allegiance. They cannot be bought with status, nor scared into submission. They do not need to be someone in the eyes of others, because they have met the self, the only authority that matters. And maybe that's why the world resists conscious individuals, not with swords, but with noise. With shallow entertainment, with dopamine traps, with ideologies that keep us angry, righteous, and externally focused. Because to make the unconscious conscious is to see through the false self, and in doing so, to see through the lies of the world. Jung doesn't offer easy answers. He doesn't promise formulas. What he proposes is demanding, painful, and deeply luminous. To look within with radical honesty and infinite compassion. Because only someone who has met themselves can truly meet another. Only someone who has embraced their shadow can stop projecting it. Only someone who has descended into their inner hell can hold the light of the spirit. And only in this way, step by step, soul by soul, can the world begin to heal. From the soul, from within, from awareness.